Welcome back, everybody. We're taking another deep dive into EU versus disinfo this week. We're looking at March 3rd to the 9th, 2025. And, well, things are getting a little strange out there. We're practically drowning in pro-Kremlin disinformation.
And it's not just the usual suspects. China seems to be taking notes.
Yeah, they're echoing some of those pro-Kremlin narratives. But let's start with Russia and how they seem to be using the concept of peace as, well, a weapon.
Right. EU versus Disinfo has this article. It's called Reminder, Russia Wants War, Not Peace. The irony is pretty blatant.
It's like they're waving a white flag with one hand and throwing grenades with the other.
Exactly. And it's not a new tactic either.
Uh,
Think back to when Macron proposed that truce, suspending attacks and not targeting civilian infrastructure, a genuine attempt to de-escalate.
Oh, right.
And Russia flat out rejected it. It's almost
Yep.
like actual peace, one where Ukraine survives, is just not acceptable to them.
And then you have Zakharova talking about a final settlement. To me, that sounds a lot like demanding total Ukrainian surrender, which isn't exactly a peace plan.
No, it's not. Final settlement in this context means exactly that, total capitulation. EU versus Disinfo has been documenting this kind of peace rhetoric for years now, and it always leads back to the same thing. Russia setting the terms, Ukraine giving up everything. It's this dangling carrot of peace, but attached to a stick that's meant to beat Ukraine into submission.
So it's peace on their terms, a Russian victory, and a Ukrainian defeat. Which brings us to China. Their approach is a bit more, well, subtle, wouldn't you say? They're trying to position themselves as this neutral peacemaker. There's an analysis of this in China on peace in Ukraine.
Yeah, China's trying to walk a fine line. On one hand, they want to look like a responsible global power advocating for peace and diplomacy. On the other, they don't want to alienate Russia. So what you see is them echoing some of those pro-Kremlin talking points, but in a more veiled way.
Like when they say the West is pouring oil on the fire by providing arms to Ukraine, or that NATO expansion is the root cause of this whole conflict.
Yeah.
Those are straight from the Kremlin's playbook.
Absolutely. And China knows it. They're aligning themselves with Russia strategically without explicitly endorsing everything they do. They'll say things like, oh, we have widespread international support for our peace proposals, but the evidence for that is pretty thin, just some vague endorsements, nothing concrete.
And then they turn around and snub the peace conference in Switzerland. If you're serious about peace, why skip a major international effort to find a solution? It seems more like they want to have their cake and eat it too.
That's the nature of this calculated ambiguity. It lets China maintain its relationship with Russia while still trying to appeal to the West. It's a balancing act for sure. How long they can pull it off is anybody's guess.
Speaking of delicate balancing acts, there was this incident involving Zelensky and some U.S. leaders that really got the pro-Kremlin media fired up. That disagreement that became public.
Oh, right.
The article Schadenfreude over the Abyss digs into this.
Yeah. I think that whole thing really showed just how desperate the Kremlin is for any kind of validation. They latched onto this disagreement, this tiny little crack in the Western facade, and blew it way out of proportions, like they were drowning and grabbing onto a piece of driftwood, even if it came from the very people they usually denounce.
And the insults, they were just brutal. Zelensky was a cocaine-addicted clown, an ungrateful pig, someone who had destroyed himself in the eyes of the American people. Medvedev even compared the Ukrainian delegation to being raped. It's just awful.
The language is deliberately dehumanizing, no question. They're trying to strip Zelensky and Ukrainians of their dignity to justify what Russia's doing. It's classic. Demonize your opponent, rally support for your cause.
And yet, here's the irony. After years of bashing America, Russia suddenly finds itself agreeing with, well, a fraction of U.S. policy, simply because it serves their immediate interests. It's pretty wild.
Right. They're so hungry for validation, any sign that their narrative is taking hold, that they'll even embrace the words of their supposed enemies. When you think about it, it really highlights how weak their entire narrative is.
It's like they're building their arguments on sandcastles, hoping nobody notices how easily they crumble. And speaking of flimsy narratives, the Kremlin seems really fixated on the idea that the EU is on the verge of collapse.
Oh, yeah. That's a recurring theme in their disinformation campaign. This image of a weak, divided Europe crumbling under pressure. They latch on to any disagreement, any sign of dissent, and present it as proof that the EU is about to implode.
Like if they wish hard enough, it'll magically come true.
Right. They're trying to sow seeds of doubt and discord, hoping to weaken the EU from the inside. But I think they underestimate the EU's ability to adapt and overcome challenges. This is a union that's weathered a lot of storms, economic crises, political upheavals, internal divisions. They've been through it all, and they always come out stronger.
What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right?
Exactly. And in this case, the Kremlin's attempts to weaken the EU might actually be backfiring. It's forcing them to confront their weaknesses, close ranks, and reaffirm their commitment to shared values and goals.
So in a way, the Kremlin is doing the EU a favor.
It's a bit ironic, isn't it? Their attempts to undermine the EU may actually be strengthening it in the long run. But that's not their intention, obviously. Their goal is to create chaos, to weaken the West, and further their own agenda.
And this disinformation campaign is a major part of that strategy.
It is. They're trying to manipulate perceptions, sow confusion, and ultimately influence decisions to their advantage. It's information warfare, plain and simple. We need to recognize the tactics they're using.
It's like a game of chess, but on the information battlefield.
And the stakes are incredibly high. The outcome of this conflict has huge implications for Europe and the world, so we need to understand what's at stake to see through this fog of disinformation.
Well said. We need to be informed, to be vigilant, to be critical of the information we're consuming. We can't just sit back and be passive bystanders in this information war.
We need to be active participants in the fight against disinformation. That's the key takeaway here. We were talking about that narrative the Kremlin keeps pushing about the EU being on the verge of collapse.
Right.
It's a pretty classic disinformation tactic. You take existing anxieties, those fears that are already out there, and you just magnify them. You create this sense of panic, this idea that things are falling apart and there's nothing anyone can do about it.
So they're preying on those pre-existing fears about European unity and stability.
Exactly. Any little crack in the facade, they'll exploit it. Economic disparities between member states, disagreements over policy, they'll highlight these things, twist them around, and present them as evidence that the whole block is crumbling.
It's like a doctor diagnosing a patient with a terminal illness based on a sniffle, isn't it?
That's a good analogy. They're taking minor symptoms and blowing them way out of proportion to create this false sense of crisis. And it's not just about the EU as a whole. They target individual European countries too. They spread disinformation designed to erode trust in governments and institutions.
So it's a multi-pronged attack, weakening Europe from within and without. But if their narrative is so flimsy, why do they keep pushing it?
Well, for one thing, repetition is a powerful tool in disinformation. The more you repeat something, the more likely people are to believe it, especially if they already have some doubts to begin with. It's about creating this sense of inevitability, like the EU's collapse is a foregone conclusion.
Like that saying, if you repeat a lie often enough, it becomes the truth.
Right. But there's another reason they push this narrative. It fits into their larger geopolitical strategy. By portraying the West as weak and divided, they undermine its credibility and influence on the world stage. A fractured Europe would be a huge strategic victory for them.
So it all comes down to power dynamics.
Absolutely. Disinformation is a tool of power, a way to shape perceptions, influence behavior, and achieve political goals. In this case, the Kremlin's using it to weaken its opponents, sow discord among their enemies, and ultimately advance their own interests.
But this isn't just some abstract geopolitical game, is it? This disinformation has real consequences for real people.
You're absolutely right. This isn't just some political chess match. The Kremlin's disinformation campaign has a direct impact on people on the ground, both in Ukraine and beyond. Think about the refugees, the families torn apart, the lives lost. Disinformation fuels fear and mistrust and division. It makes it that much harder to find solutions and build a lasting peace.
It's a good reminder that words have power, that manipulating information can have devastating consequences. So what can we do about it? How do we counter this wave of disinformation?
Well, awareness is always the first step. We have to understand the tactics being used, the narratives being pushed, and the motivations behind them. Once we're aware of the problem, we can start to develop strategies to address it.
Knowledge is power, as they say.
Exactly. We need to arm ourselves with knowledge, with critical thinking skills. We need to be able to tell fact from fiction, to spot bias and manipulation, to evaluate information sources critically.
So it's about becoming more discerning consumers of information.
Yes, we can't just passively absorb everything we see and hear. We need to be active, engaged, and critical thinkers, questioning what we're told, seeking out diverse perspectives.
Skeptical, but not cynical. Open to different viewpoints, but also able to see through manipulation and deceit.
That's a good way to put it. We need that balance between skepticism and open-mindedness, between critical thinking and empathy. And we have to remember, disinformation is a complex problem. There are no easy solutions.
No magic bullet. No silver lining.
I'm afraid not. Countering disinformation takes a multifaceted approach. It requires governments, media organizations, tech companies, and individuals working together. We need to promote media literacy, expose and debunk false narratives, and hold those spreading disinformation accountable.
It's a collective effort then.
Absolutely. We all have a role to play in this fight. But it's not just about reacting to disinformation. It's about proactively promoting accurate and reliable information.
So it's not just defense, it's offense as well.
You got it. We need to support independent journalism, amplify credible voices, and create a media environment where truth and accuracy can actually thrive.
We need to build a more resilient information ecosystem, one that's less susceptible to manipulation and deceit.
Right. And that takes a long-term commitment to media literacy, critical thinking, and ethical journalism.
It's a challenge, no doubt, but it's one we have to face if we want to protect our democracies and preserve a shared reality.
I agree. The stakes are just too high to ignore.
Now let's shift gears a bit. We've been talking about disinformation broadly, but I want to focus in on a specific tactic that the Kremlin has been using very effectively.
Oh. And what's that?
Whataboutism.
Ah, yes. The classic deflection.
Exactly. Whenever they face criticism, any accusations, they just deflect and point the finger back at the West. But what about what you did in Iraq? What about your support for this or that regime?
Right. It's all about avoiding accountability, shifting the blame, muddy the waters, and create a false equivalency between their actions and those of the West.
And it works because it plays on our sense of fairness, our desire for consistency. It makes people wonder if the West really has the moral high ground to criticize Russia, even when their actions are clearly wrong.
It's a form of moral relativism. It blurs the lines between right and wrong, creates a sense of moral ambiguity, and it's particularly effective in this world of information warfare, where narratives often matter more than facts.
So how do we counter this whataboutism? How do we keep it from derailing the conversation and obscuring the truth?
Well, the first thing is to recognize it for what it is, a deflection tactic meant to avoid accountability. We can't let ourselves get sucked into these false equivalencies.
Then we need to call it out.
Yes. We need to make it clear that just because the West has made mistakes in the past, that doesn't excuse what Russia is doing now. We have to hold them accountable for their own behavior, not let them off the hook by deflecting blame.
Acknowledge past wrongs, but don't let them be used as a shield for present ones.
Exactly. We need to be honest about the past, but also focus on the present and hold those responsible for wrongdoing accountable.
It's a delicate balance, but one we have to strive for if we want to have these tough conversations, these honest and productive conversations about complex issues.
Well said. And it's important to remember this isn't just a theoretical debate. This disinformation, this whataboutism, has real-world consequences. It shapes public opinion, influences policy decisions, and it can actually impact the course of the conflict.
Words have power, and the battle for hearts and minds is just as important as the battle on the battlefield.
I completely agree. We cannot afford to lose that battle.
Okay. Before we wrap things up, I want to touch on one more aspect of the Kremlin's disinformation campaign that I find particularly insidious.
What's that?
Their use of humor, satire.
Ah, yes. The weaponization of laughter.
Exactly. They've gotten really good at using humor and satire to spread their propaganda and undermine their opponents.
It's very effective. It disarms people, makes them more receptive to the message. When you're laughing, you're less likely to be critical or skeptical.
And they've built up this whole network of satirical news shows and online personalities who spread their propaganda under the guise of entertainment.
It's a form of soft power, right? You influence people without them even realizing it. Package the propaganda in a more palatable format, make it easier to digest and to share.
And it's not just about getting laughs. They're using humor to ridicule their opponents, to make them look foolish and incompetent, to undermine their credibility.
It's character assassination, basically. Make your enemies look untrustworthy. And it can be very effective, especially online, where memes and satirical content can go viral very quickly.
So how do we counter this weaponized humor? How do we keep ourselves from being manipulated by laughter?
Well, once again, awareness is key. We need to be aware that humor can be used as a propaganda tool. We need to be critical of the messages, even if they're presented in a funny way.
Laugh with caution.
Exactly. We can still enjoy humor, enjoy satire, but be mindful of the source. Be mindful of the intent. Ask ourselves who's making me laugh and why.
Be discerning consumers of humor.
Yes. We need to be able to separate genuine humor from propaganda masquerading as entertainment.
It's a challenge, but one we have to face if we want to avoid being manipulated by laughter.
Well said. And remember, humor can be a powerful tool for good, too. We can use it to expose hypocrisy, to challenge authority, and to promote critical thinking.
So it's not about rejecting humor altogether. It's about using it wisely, responsibly.
Right. We need to reclaim humor as a tool for truth and justice, not let it be used as a weapon for disinformation.
They've turned disinformation into an art form, haven't they? Using every tool they can get their hands on to manipulate what people see and believe.
That's why it's so hard to counter. You're not just debunking individual lies, you're trying to dismantle entire narratives. You have to expose the assumptions, the biases that make those narratives so appealing in the first place.
It's like peeling an onion. You keep digging, trying to get to the heart of it.
And often what you find at the center isn't truth, but a carefully constructed illusion meant to deceive.
So how do you break through that? How do you help people see through the smoke and mirrors?
Well, there's no easy answer, unfortunately, no magic solution. But I think it starts with education. We need to give people the critical thinking skills they need to navigate this complicated information landscape.
So empowering people to think for themselves, to question what they're being told, to look for different perspectives.
Exactly. We need to help them develop a healthy skepticism, a sense of, wait a minute, is this really true? We need to encourage them to be active participants, not passive consumers, engage in respectful dialogue, share accurate information, and challenge falsehoods when they see them.
Create a culture of critical thinking, where people are encouraged to question, to challenge, and to think critically.
Exactly. And foster this sense of shared responsibility for the information we consume and pass along. We all have a role to play in fighting disinformation and making society more trustworthy and informed.
So it's not just about individual responsibility, it's about collective action.
Right. We need to work together. Support those organizations fighting disinformation, hold the spreaders of lies accountable, and create a media environment where truth and accuracy can flourish.
It's a tall order, but a vital one if we want to protect our democracies and preserve a shared reality.
I agree. The stakes are just too high to look the other way.
It all comes back to that, doesn't it?
Yeah.
This isn't some abstract debate. This is about real people, real lives, and the future of our societies.
It is. And the choices we make now, the information we choose to consume, the stories we choose to believe, they'll shape the world we build tomorrow.
We need to choose carefully.
Absolutely.
Well, that's about all the time we have for this deep dive. I hope this has been insightful for you. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back next week with more analysis and insights. Until then, stay informed, stay engaged, and keep asking those critical questions.